Time now for the Sunday Talk, where we tap into the debate of the week. This week, the Canadian dream of home ownership. In the Toronto and Vancouver areas, where close to a third of Canadians live, that dream is on life support. Even renting is hard. BC brought in laws to try to clamp down on prices last year. Now, Ontario is too.
We really have had months of consultation.
In Ontario, a BC-style foreign buyers tax, stricter rent control, and efforts to restrict flipping are in the pipeline. New rules to cool a housing market that's getting so hot, so fast, market watchers are worrying about a meltdown that could affect millions.
Prices of houses can go down as well as up.
Last month, the average price of a detached house in the Greater Toronto Area was $1.21 million. That's up 33.4% from last year. And some landlords are jacking up rent by as much as 100%.
Even if our rent was going up a little bit, that would be okay, but 100%.
The big cities are like supernovas, heating home prices up over huge areas, even in the small towns. Now, people are getting priced out of places like Shelburne and Orangeville in Ontario, Powell River and Squamish in BC.
Henry and Pat Cruzen are a successful young couple with a just christened daughter. They live in a basement apartment in suburban Toronto. He should be able to afford a house, but at today's prices, he can't.
Of course, anxiety over the Canadian dream is as old as the dream itself.
It's getting to the point now where you can't really go into a home to say that I will own this home in 30 years. You've got to consider it as rent.
But after decades of chasing home ownership, is the dream dead? Or are young Canadians finally waking up to a common reality in places like Manhattan, Paris, or London, where you live small and pay a lot of rent? I'm joined by our panelists. Supriya Dwivedi is a radio talk show host in Toronto. Tasha Carradine is a radio talk show host here too. And Stephen Marsh is a culture writer for Esquire. So Supriya is the only renter. I'm going to start with you. In that clip we heard, oh my goodness, 30-year mortgage. I mean, wouldn't some people be grateful to have a 30-year mortgage they could afford now?
Well,
How serious is this?
Yeah, well, I think it's quite serious. And I think if we're looking at the way prices continue to increase and the way that they are, in that the only way to get into the housing market is if you're the descendant of other homeowners who can borrow from the equity in their homes to be able to help you with your down payment. And look, I'm in the position in which my in-laws are very graciously and very generously helping us with our fictional down payment that will hopefully happen in the future. And the only reason why we'd be able to do that is with their help. But if you constantly need parental help to even make it into the housing market, then we're talking about exacerbating income inequality to the point where you're separating those who are landowners and those who are not, and you're going back to pre-industrial revolution almost.
So are we talking about serious levels of inequality?
I think we may, I'm not saying we're going to get to Hunger Games tomorrow, but I think if we continue this route, we should be very concerned about who can be a homeowner, and that's certainly not going to be anybody in the middle class.
So is this what we want, Stephen?
That's not what I want. I don't think it's what ordinary Canadians want either. I mean, I don't think we want to take, in the package they talked about cities like New York and Paris and these huge, I mean, that comes along with a huge cost, which is exactly this spiking income inequality. The average Canadian, 50% of their net worth is in their home, right? So if that access to that kind of growth, personal financial net worth growth, is only available to, as you say, people who inherit money, this is going to lead us down the path that these cities have taken, New York, London, Paris, and that does not look like a good path to me. That does not look like a path that we want to be on.
So unless you've got a big house that you've paid off, it may not be what we want, but should the government be coming in to change all of this? Like, should the dream be allowed to die?
To die. You know what, Wendy, I think, I don't think that it is as big a crisis as people make it out to be in the evolution of our big cities. Because yes, there are people who rent, generations of people rent in places like Paris, New York, other large cities. It's seen as normal. Canada is one of the highest home ownership rates in the world. And I think that there is a dream here. There's definitely a dream that we are in a generation that's kind of in between the two. I think younger people, millennials in particular, also have a very different attitude towards ownership of a lot of things, including potentially housing, but because their parents and us still have this vision of the house as the primary asset and other things, we're hanging on to it, but I think it is going to die.
I also would just point out that cities like New York, London, and Paris also they act like cities. And I don't know if Canadian cities act like cities or big urban centers in the way that we should. And if you're in New York, you're not getting a single detached house, and that isn't the dream. You have high dense areas that are that are very populated, and I don't think Canadian cities are being run in a way that
But those
would make
houses will be eliminated eventually. I mean, this is the thing in Toronto, in other large cities in Canada, we have a lot of close detached houses close to the downtown core, which is an anomaly. But when you look at all the condo projects and everything's going up in places like Vancouver, Toronto, and other big cities, those houses may eventually be replaced.
Look, I mean, I just think the reality is that the big Canadian cities right now are on the cusp. We have an immense opportunity. As the rest of the world is crumbling into these regionalisms and restricting trade, we've somehow managed to stumble onto a way to be open and tolerant and also pro-trade. And this makes our cities very attractive. I mean, that's why these markets are spiking. The question is, are we going to have the moral strength and the intelligence to choose the kind of city that we want to be, rather than stumbling back onto these models from New York?
So that means government intervention, right?
Oh, well,
Is that
obviously.
what you're calling for?
We're in Canada, right? this is the answer to everything.
But it doesn't work. It doesn't. Look at Vancouver. They intervened. The market in the last month has shot up 50% in terms of the houses on the market. It's gone up again. You can intervene as much as you want until interest rates go down. The reality is money is cheap. Our real estate compared to other places in the world is cheap. Go up, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. Exactly. When interest rates go up, that's when the market will correct itself. Until then, anything government does is just a Band-Aid.
But then we're in a position, and I'm not necessarily for government intervention either, but I think if we let the market to correct itself, we're not looking at letting the air out of the bubble in a slow and steady sort of way. We're looking at a bubble popping, and we're looking at a whole lot of folks unable to be able to afford their mortgage. And right now, if you're looking at a single detached house going for $1.2 million, forget about the $260,000 down that you need, and then the $40,000 in closing costs up front, by the way, in liquid cash that you need to have.
But why does everyone have to live in a single detached house?
You absolutely don't. And I'm saying yes, but I'm saying that you're looking at a mortgage payment of $4,400, right? So there's already a subset of the Canadian population that cannot afford that. I think you're right, though. We do need a cultural shift, and we need to kill the single detached home with fire and get rid of it. And we've been fed this lie for so long that we need to own a house in order to enter into adulthood somehow. And I just don't think it's viable anymore, especially in any major city.
What about renting? I mean, is that rents? There's rent control in some cities now. Rents have skyrocketed in many places. Is that the solution? Like, if you're giving up the idea of home ownership, maybe, but having a large home where you can have your kids run around, should there be rent controls, do you think, Stephen?
Well, I think we're at a situation, I mean, the 33% growth year over year in Toronto and what happened in Vancouver, which was even more extreme. Like, we're in an all hands on deck situation here. Like, we're going to try everything to try and contain this. And saying we have to wait for a market correction, I mean, that's like saying, I'll quit smoking when I have the heart attack. Like, we have to actually figure out a way to do this.
This is the market. I don't think it's necessarily going to correct. And if interest rates do go up, presumably they won't go up skyrocketing overnight. If they do, then it's a crisis in many, many areas, not just housing. But the point is, this is the new market. I think this is the new reality.
But then if that happens, then people are blaming government for not having stepped in and intervened harder, no? I feel like government is damned if they do, damned if they don't.
What is going to happen? The new measures in Toronto, there's going to be a potential vacancy tax. There's going to be a foreign buyers tax like Vancouver has. That money, in BC actually, the foreign buyers tax raised less money than the province and the city lost in terms of land transfer tax. So they actually lost revenue. So in a bizarre way, governments are shortchanging themselves too with these taxes. It is not a zero-sum game that everyone's going to win.
So, Stephen, do you really think that government intervention can bring prices down?
No, look, I mean, the basic fact is in these big cities, which are very attractive, like, people are moving there, and there isn't enough development to meet their needs. Like, that's just the basic market reality that we're dealing with. And I agree with you. Like, but we have to contain it. We have to try to contain the damage from this, because the way it's going now is, literally heart attack territory.
But we keep talking about Canadian world-class cities. Maybe that's just the price of living in a world-class city.
Well, then we should act like a world-class city, and we should have the infrastructure, and we should have the urban agenda, and elect people to local city councils all across this country that will adopt that sort of mentality. And right now, I just don't see it, whether it's in Toronto, Vancouver, or Montreal.
And that too, in terms of public spaces, I think this is another thing. You look at big cities in Europe, in New York, for example, they have large public spaces. There's an investment in public space that we don't necessarily have in our cities because we're used to having the single detached house with the yard and people having their private space. So that mentality has to shift as well to allow people to have quality lives in smaller condos or homes.
Look, I mean, Canadian cities are run, generally are run by, I mean, there are exceptions, but they're run by people who don't want to be in big cities, they want to be in small towns, and this is no longer sustainable. Like, we actually need to have a leadership in these urban environments where we can actually transition into being the mega cities that we're going inevitably to be. And like, I actually think that the Canadian problem is not planning for success, thinking, oh, it's all just going to, we're all just really small and irrelevant, and we should just get out along with our quiet lives. And that's not enough anymore. Like, that's actually going to ruin the future. Because, I mean, look at any of these cities, I think, any of the big cities in Canada.
So then your kids, you're okay with your kids, when they have kids someday, of being in a one-bedroom condo?
They'll live the dream and live out in Oshawa.
Or Halifax.
Hamilton, yeah, Halifax.
Well, is that the
back to
future then,
Halifax.
Tasha? Is it everybody should move to Atlantic Canada, or Quebec is still inexpensive?
Well, that's what's interesting. People will make choices, and there are more choices available to workers today, telecommuting and other things that do allow some people to say, look, I'm going to build a life for myself in Halifax instead of...
They don't ever make those choices.
But then that's their choice, exactly. If you want to live... I have friends who moved to New York City, lived in a tiny, like not even a studio, 2 people with 1 bed in each corner of the room, paying an obscene amount of rent. That's the price they knew they had to pay to make it there. And now they're living very quality lives there, probably in still less space you get in Toronto or Vancouver. But that was their choice, is my point.
You're not moving?
No, no.
You got to make a living.
And I mean, I think ultimately, I think it's very easy to say that why don't you just move to, a rural area and telecommute? But how many employers are like, yes, telecommute every day? Come on.
Yeah, come on.
Yeah.
Well, unless there's a crash, we're probably looking at the last generation of middle-class people being able to afford a home downtown. And I'm sure everyone outside of Vancouver and Toronto is feeling very sorry for us. But thank you very much. Thanks.